Now, in this study of Revelation, we've come to this point taking time to study what we can about the time of the kingdom because the Bible gives us so much to learn in that area. But ironically, it doesn't come out of the book of Revelation. You remember, as we've been studying, we've been looking at the events of Revelation in sections as the book itself gives it to us. And we came into chapter 20 and we found ourselves in a view of the kingdom as it's mentioned in chapter 20, but only in a handful of verses in that chapter is the kingdom covered at all. And once you pass that brief mention of the kingdom in chapter 20, John in the book of Revelation tells us that what comes after that is the destruction of our current planet. It will burn up, and in its place, in chapters 21 and 22 of Revelation, we're going to learn about a new heavens and a new earth that's coming. We want to finish in our understanding of what happens in the 1,000 years of the kingdom. And as I said, the book of Revelation just doesn't tell us much about what's in that period of time. So what we've been doing is moving outside this book and studying Old Testament passages that do tell us quite a bit about what life in the kingdom will be like. All right, today we're going to examine the temple operation of the kingdom, including the sacrificial system and the kingdom law. We're going to start with that tour of the temple, as I said. We'll go through the temple itself. I'm going to give you a virtual tour of what we think it will look like based on the descriptions God gives us. Then we're going to talk about worship and sacrifice in the kingdom under the new kingdom law and what that means. Now, the only temple that you hear mentioned in the book of Revelation is the temple that's constructed during the tribulation. That's where we find out about that in chapter 11. John tells us that he's asked to measure a tribulation temple, and Daniel 12 told us that the tribulation temple has to be cleansed from the image of the beast that has been placed there by the false prophet, and that it takes 30 days after the tribulation ends before the cleansing of that image from the temple, the removal of that image, happens. Well, the fact that Daniel is still talking about this building 30 days after Jesus returns tells us that this temple is intended to continue on into the kingdom, although when we get into the kingdom, we're not going to be using the temple that was built during tribulation. Far from it. We're going to be using one that is far grander than that one. But it just goes to the point that there will be a temple, and Ezekiel confirms that for us. In chapter 40, verse 2, Ezekiel, getting a vision from God, says this: "In the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, and on it to the south there was a structure like a city. So he brought me there, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of bronze, with a line of flax and a measuring rod in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. The man said to me, Son of man, see with your eyes and hear with your ears, and give attention to all that I'm going to show you, for you have been brought here in order to show it to you. Declare to the house of Israel all that you see." Now that's where the discussion of the temple begins in the book of Ezekiel. That man got the privilege of seeing and describing the millennial temple for Israel and for us. And he starts by saying it was positioned on a high mountain. Now, and he goes on to say that on top of this mountain, he sees a structure that is so massive, he calls it a city because it looks that way to him. Now, if you look at the way Israel appears today, for example, the topography of it, it's very different. I mean, it's hilly, yes, it's got valleys, but it's certainly not the kind of mountain that you would call chief of the world, and it's not as tall as many other mountains, even in the Middle East. So it will change dramatically by the time we get to the kingdom period. After God has raised up this huge mountain, Ezekiel says there'll be a city on top of it, and Ezekiel is told to go measure it. Now, why is he measuring this building? Because by the measurements we gain out of the book of Ezekiel, we gain an appreciation of the massive scale of this building that is going to be the temple of the Millennial Kingdom. And one of the important reasons why we need to know its dimensions is so that we are confident that we are looking at something we have never seen before. That would preclude us from assuming this is Ezekiel describing some prior temple. Because when you look at the dimensions, it's clear nothing like this has ever existed before. And tonight we're going to walk through this building based on those dimensions and on some artists' rendering that I have that are very useful in showing you what this building will be like when we actually see it in person. And it starts with gaining an appreciation of its scale. And I think the easiest way to do that is to compare this structure to other things we're already familiar with. And let's start with a simple graphic. The original temple, or rather tabernacle as it was called when Moses built it, was little more than a tent structure surrounded by a fence. So that little yellow square that you see standing next to it, that's the relative size of the entire compound that held the tabernacle, the fence and everything within it. Now, after a few centuries, God gave Israel the right to build a temple proper, a stone building. He gave it to Solomon to do it. When Solomon built the temple, he wanted something more ornate than the tabernacle, obviously, so he built it a little bigger. So now you see that slightly orange square. That's the footprint of Solomon's temple in the day that he built it. You can see it's a little bigger. And then later, after a lot of things came about, there was eventually a temple in Herod's day. But before you look at that, let me put something else on the screen that you're a little more familiar with. Here's something most Americans are familiar with, a football field. Now you can see how big a football field is compared to Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple is a little more than half the size of a football field. Then we get to the time of Herod. Herod built a temple that was quite impressive. Herod's temple dwarfed the prior temple of Solomon. But what about the Millennial Temple? How big would it be in comparison to these buildings? Well, that's how big the Millennial Temple will be compared to what we've seen before. Multiple football fields in size. It's a huge structure. And the reality of an operating temple with priests and guards, we're told, at the doors, and all the size of it and the number of people that will be able to flood into this space at one time, all of that is a reminder to us of how prevalent sin will be in the kingdom. Not with us, of course, not with glorified human beings, but with the world that's populating around us in a natural form, in a sinful form. This is a temple for dealing with that sin. And above all, it will be a place of ruling, for Jesus will be ruling in this place. And because of his perfect rule, the effects of sin, as we said last time, will be greatly mitigated. Now, this structure is a perfect square, as you can see by my graphic. Here's a dimensional drawing of the building, looking at it from the standpoint of what we're given in the Book of Ezekiel, the various dimensions. There is just generally an outer wall that is surrounding the whole of it. From there, you have 3 gates in the wall on the northeast and south sides. Then as you come in, there's a courtyard created by those walls. Following that, as you go a little further, you end up looking at a inner court made by a second wall that's inside the outer wall. It too has only 3 gates on the north, south, and east sides. Neither has a westward entrance. And then as you go in through that inner wall, you find the temple proper, and we'll look at that here more in a minute. So let's start by coming through the building, walking as it is, or as it were, virtually, from the east gate, the main entrance, inward through all of these structures. And we start by looking at it from the outside. There's a man there. That's the bronze man that Ezekiel said he was meeting in his vision, who took him around and showed him the place. And he's got that measuring rod there in his hand, because that's what Ezekiel was given to measure. And as we walk in, you'll see measurements like up against the wall there. You'll see that rod standing against the wall as a way of giving you a reference to size, to height. That's about a 10-foot wall there. So now we're going to walk in through that wall. And as we do, this is a general schematic for how the gate appears. Remember, gates in this time and in the time of ancient Israel was not a swinging gate on a wall. It was a chamber, multi-chambered room, and it's called a gate, but it's actually a big open room. And as you come into this space, this is what you're going to be met by, a 6-chambered gate. And so as we walk in, this is the front, coming up the steps. This is what the room looks like from above. So you enter from the right, walk through the chamber, and exit into the courtyard through your left, on the left there. In the chambers, you have these guard rooms, basically 1, 2, 3 on each side, total of 6. And you see them there in the sort of in the recesses of it. As you come out into the inner court, the what's called the outer court, which is the first area of the temple as you enter in. These courtyards, or these guard rooms, by the way, are set up specifically to guard the entrance, which tells you something. If you need guards in the Millennial Kingdom, there's still sin. There's still concern about what happens. Now, as we exit this inner gate, this is another view as if you were walking through it. So as you exit this inner gate and you come out of it, you're met. This is the inside edge of that wall, and it's covered by a porch. And you notice there are palm trees that decorate right above the gate here. And Ezekiel tells us that around all of these entrances there will be palm trees marking the entrances. And if you wonder, why are there palm trees there? What's the significance? Well, if you imagine this courtyard filled with millions of people, and you can see how similar the outside looks as you look around, if you didn't have those palm trees at the top, you wouldn't know where the exit was. So it's a way of marking the exits as you come in and out of the building. They're also on the inner gates in that inner wall. Let's get a little bird's eye view here. Here again, we've come in now from the bottom, from the east gate. There's those palm branches I just talked about. And then here's the first courtyard created by that outer wall, and it's quite huge. And if you keep going east, you're going to go through a second gate, the inner gate, which leads into the area of the temple proper. Here again, there's only gates on the north and south and east sides on both the inner and the outer gate. No entrance from the west side. Keep moving here. As you come to that first, back up here, as you come to the inner gate, there's more palm branches marking the gates. You also notice down here little tables. Ezekiel tells us that there are tables here for sacrifice, and the priests will be doing sacrifice of animals, actually slitting the throats of the animals and so on those tables. And if you were to pass through that gate from this side and come through, now you'd find yourself in the inner court. And in the inner court, what you find prominently is the altar where the sacrifice is burned. You have steps up to the altar in the center of this courtyard. Here's another scene of the side of the altar. And then, of course, if you go a little further, you come up the steps into the temple proper. And looking in from the inside of the temple, now that's the outside, and then you've walked through the threshold of the temple. The first temple, if you remember, had these, this is the tabernacle from the desert time of Moses. The beginning of this place had a veil, a curtain. So in the case of the millennial temple, no door, no curtain, according to Ezekiel. But in Moses' time, you couldn't see into the building. You had to go through a curtain. And if you looked inside what was built for Moses' time, if you notice, there was another veil that separated 1/3 of the space from the other 2/3. This was the holy place, and the smaller section was called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place. And in it were various pieces of furniture as specified in the law. If we go look now at the Millennial Temple, this is the 2/3 space, the larger space called the Holy Place. No furniture. In fact, the only furniture is this little table, which is hard to see here, but it's the table of incense. It's where they burned incense, and it's the only piece of furniture in the Millennial Temple. In fact, if you go from this room now into the smaller section, the Holy of Holies, it's a completely empty room, according to Ezekiel. There's no furniture in that space. So all of the furniture that was originally in the tabernacle had some significance in picturing Christ and his redemptive work. But now that we have Christ present on the earth, there's no need for a picture of Christ. He's there. So instead of pictures of Christ, the only furniture that remains is the one that pictures prayer before the Father. That is, Christ interceding before the Father who is still in heaven, and as such, it is still an appropriate piece of furniture to have, because it does represent something that is still happening in that day, which is, of course, intercession. All right, moving on a few more. This is an overview of the temple structure we just walked into. So here's the entrance. Here's the Holy of Holies and the holy place. And if you notice, around it are other structures. There's 2 buildings on either side that flank it, and there's another building called the West Building behind it. Now, these 2 that flank are the priests' quarters. These are where the priests will enter every day and change into their priestly garb, and then they can come out from there directly into the area where they perform the sacrificial service. In effect, these are the priests' locker rooms, because they're told that they have to change out of their priestly garb when they finish duty for the day before they're allowed to exit and go back out into the general population. And then the building that's behind the temple, we're not quite sure what that is. It's not described in Ezekiel. It's just, we know that by dimensions given that it exists there. Finally, here's an overview of those buildings sort of filled in. You can see them named for you there. The temple itself, the priestly chambers on either side, and this mysterious west building behind it. If you looked at the priestly chambers up close, this is how they're described. They're a multi-tiered structure with galleries for priests, I guess, to observe what's going on. And they have entrances and exits through these hallways that lead them in and out of their chambers. If you look more closely at the temple, Ezekiel also says there is a river that emerges out from underneath the foundations of the temple. You see it represented there with that thin blue line that comes out next to the stairs. That river then runs in a channel in the courtyard, we're told, under the gates of the temple. So it proceeds out from the temple underneath the inner gate and through the outer courtyard, and then underneath the outer gate, eventually emerging outside the temple altogether, right next to the east gate. As it moves, it gets bigger. There's a point in time at which Ezekiel follows it, as he's told, and it becomes bigger and bigger to the point where he's wading into it up to his neck and he has to get out, otherwise he can't swim in it. So as that water continues to flow, it continues to magnify. When it comes out of the temple and off the mountain, it's flowing in two directions and begins to run both east and the west side, that is out toward the Mediterranean Sea, and then also eastward into the Dead Sea. When it hits the Dead Sea, it makes it fresh. So that's a quick run through of the temple building itself. I told you the temple will be the center of worship in the kingdom, and that worship involves Jesus in the building, sacrifice taking place outside the building, priests serving, and even feast days that happen at various points during the year. Let's begin by discussing Christ's place in the temple, and it begins with his place in earlier temples. So in the original tabernacle that Moses built, there is a time in which we're told that in that tabernacle the glory of God would appear above the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, in that smaller chambered space within the tabernacle. That glowing glory of God was Christ pre-incarnate, occupying, dwelling with people, his people, in the tabernacle. Later, when Solomon built that more majestic temple, well, there's a moment when we're hearing of the building of that structure when Solomon is praying and dedicating it, and God appears again in the form of the Shekinah glory, and once again occupies that same place, only now, of course, it's even more majestic, and the glory of God fills that house, we're told. That went on for centuries until there came a time when the Lord eventually departed his temple. It happened in Ezekiel's day. In fact, Ezekiel is the one to describe it. It came as a result of Israel's sin and God's desire to judge them for it. And God told Israel he would be sending Nebuchadnezzar and the army of Babylon down into Jerusalem to conquer the city, to destroy the temple, and to exile his people. Now, of course, God wasn't going to remain in his temple and allow Nebuchadnezzar's army to come into that place while he was present. So shortly before Nebuchadnezzar arrived with his army, God departed from the temple. He made his glory leave the temple and depart. And he did it in a very particular way. He started by moving out of the Holy of Holies and proceeding through the building, we're told by Ezekiel, and resting on the threshold, on the doorway to the temple. And he paused there for a time. Ezekiel says this in chapter 10, verse 4. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the temple, and the temple was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. So he moves first to that point, and then secondly, after having paused there, he moves to the east gate of the temple structure. Remember, the temple that we're looking at now is similar, at least in relative terms, to the one that Solomon built. That is, there's an east gate that directly is opposite the doorway to the temple. So the Shekinah glory of God moved out of the Holy of Holies to the threshold, then out of the threshold, proceeding east, to the gate for the temple. Ezekiel tells us this in chapter 10, verse 18. Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim. When the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings and rose up from the earth in my sight with their wheels beside them. And then they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of God of Israel hovered over them. So that was the next stage of God's movement. Finally, we're told that the glory of the Lord moves outside the temple, across the Kidron Valley, and up to the top of the Mount of Olives. You notice in this rendering of today of modern Israel, you can see that's a directly eastward movement. So he's continued going east up to the Mount of Olives, and then we're told he gets to the top of this peak, to the Mount of Olives, and pauses once more. Remember, all of this is happening back in the time of Ezekiel in roughly 600 BC. And Ezekiel says this in chapter 11, verse 23. The glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain, which is east of the city. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God to the exiles in Chaldea, so the vision that I had seen left me. So that's the end of the story of the movement of God. After he's last seen hovering, as it were, on the top of the Mount of Olives, then the glory of the Lord disappears. It has never returned to the temple in any of its forms since that day. That was the last time God inhabited a temple on earth. So God left heading east up to the Mount of Olives. Now what's interesting about that is that in the book of Acts, after Jesus departs the earth, he departs from the same place. And as he's leaving, if you remember in the book of Acts chapter 1, as the disciples watch him disappear, the angels that are there say, he will return as you see him leaving. That is, he will come back to the Mount of Olives. We're going to see how he comes back to dwell in the temple yet again, coming from the east. And that's in Ezekiel chapter 43. Let's just start there. Ezekiel 43, chapter 1. This now is describing the scene at the outset of the kingdom. This is one of the first events that begins the 1,000-year reign of the kingdom. Jesus coming in triumphantly and gloriously to occupy the millennial temple. Chapter 43, verse 1, Ezekiel says, Then he led me to the gate facing toward the east, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east, and his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory, and it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. And the visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Kebar, and I fell on my face. And the glory of the Lord, notice, the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. Now remember, that's the one inside the second wall. He brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. Then I heard someone speaking to me from the house. Now this is a voice coming out of the temple. From a man, while a man was standing beside me. And the voice coming out of the house said, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever. And the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their harlotry and by their corpses of the kings when they die, by setting their threshold by my threshold, and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only the wall between me and them. And they've defiled my holy name by their abominations which they've committed, so I've consumed them in my anger. Now let them put their harlotry and the corpses of their kings far from me, and I will dwell among them forever. Let's go through that same process that Ezekiel just went through. Here's what it would look like. The glory of the Lord coming in from the east gate, that's the gate, crossing the outer temple courtyard into the inner gate, and then proceeding up the stairs through the inner gate. And it's at that point that the man that was with Ezekiel said, come into the inner court with me. So then he could see him from the inner court coming up, passing over the altar, over the threshold into the house of the Lord, proceeding into the holy place, through the holy place, and then ultimately into the Holy of Holies. And as he does that, he fills the temple with his glory, we're told. And that is how he now will stay. He lives there continually. So forevermore, throughout the 1,000 years, as you were to come to the temple, with no door there and no curtains, etc., if you position yourself in just the right way, looking into the temple from the east toward the west, you'll see the glory of God in the temple, resident in the temple. In fact, he is so much permanently there that Ezekiel goes on to tell us that once he has made the journey that we just watched, that door, that east gate, the outer east gate that he started in, it will be shut forever, and it will never open again for the entire length of the 1,000-year kingdom. This is what we read in Ezekiel 44, verse 1. Then he brought me back by way of the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces the east, and it was shut. The Lord said to me, this gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it, for the Lord God of Israel has entered by it, therefore it shall be shut. And we're told in Ezekiel that since the east gate is permanently closed, David, the prince, if you remember, as he's called in Scripture, the one who will rule over Israel under the authority of Christ, this becomes his office. Ezekiel tells us that he sets up office there every day. He goes in every day and he conducts whatever business God has for him, and then he goes away at the end of the day. This is his office, and just like anyone else going to the office, of course, he brings his lunch, and this is the place that he hangs out. So if you want to see David, this is where you go to find him. All right, now the only time that believers and glorified saints will see Jesus in the temple is when we go there to worship. And Ezekiel tells us that this can happen on a few times. And the times that we can go into the temple and see Jesus are feast days, Sabbath days, and new moon festivals or new moon celebrations. Now, let's talk about the feasts first. There are only two feasts in the kingdom, the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Booths, according to what's written in Ezekiel. Now, if you kind of compare that to what we know Israel received in the first time through the law of Moses, their calendar months, they map to our months a little differently because they have a calendar based on lunar time. Ours is based on solar time. But under the law of Moses, there were 7 feasts. And those 7 feasts were grouped into 3 in the spring, 3 in the fall, and then 1 that came sort of in the middle. And all of those feasts have prophetic pictures of Jesus in them. The first 3 feasts represent aspects of Jesus' first coming. The last 3 all have pictures of his second coming. And the one that sits right between them, well, that represents the church period, the church that exists between the 2 appearances of Jesus. But as I said, in Ezekiel, we're told there are only 2 of these that survive for the purpose of the kingdom. The first one and the last one. The Passover and the one for the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. And the Feast of Passover, of course, represents Jesus' redemption through his sacrifice on the cross. The Feast of Tabernacles represents Jesus dwelling among people in booths, that is, in tents, dwelling among those who are his people. And as it turns out, those are the only 2 of the 7 that still have present-day spiritual significance in the temple, period, in the time of the kingdom. The other 5 have been fulfilled and no longer have significance in the time of the kingdom. For example, there's no church anymore, so we don't need a Pentecost feast anymore, and so on. All right, so moving on. Those are the 2 times a year you'll be able to go to the temple and celebrate a feast. In addition to the feast days, you can go to the temple on a Sabbath. There is a Sabbath day again. And there are also new moon days. In Ezekiel chapter 46, verse 3, it says, the people of the land shall also worship at the doorway of that gate before the Lord on the Sabbaths and on the new moons. And then it goes on, but when the people of the land come before the Lord at the appointed feasts, he who enters by way of the north gate to worship shall go out by way of the south gate. And he who enters by way of the south gate shall go out by way of the north gate. No one shall return by the way of the gate by which he entered, but shall go straight out. Isn't that an interesting little requirement? Let me explain what's going on here. Whenever we go into the temple, we can only come in by either the north or the south gate because there's only 3 to begin with, and one of them, the east gate, has been permanently closed. So by necessity, you're down to 2, north or south, pick one. But whichever one you go in, let's say, for example, in this case, you come in by the north gate. As you come in, if you're going to leave, you got to leave by the south gate, the Lord said. You cannot go back out by the way you came in. So after you're done, you go out the other side, and you're done. Now, why is that a requirement? Well, as you go through this courtyard in that one-way direction, you are forced to pass by the entrance that looks directly into the Holy of Holies. And it will be your opportunity as you peer through that inner east gate and in the distance up the stairs into the heart of the temple. For a brief moment, you'll get a glimpse of the glory of God. You notice in this drawing, for example, the artist has projected the light of the temple out into the courtyard. And so as you walk by it, you have a brief moment at which to spy, to see the glory of God. Unbelievers will never enter the temple. So think about this. Unbelievers will never see the glory of God. This is why unbelief is possible, because they'll see the outside of a building on the top of a high mountain, but what goes on inside will be a complete mystery to them. There'll never be a time they can make that trek from the north gate to the south gate, or vice versa, and spy through the wall and see the glory of God. Unbelievers will be required, though, to come up to the temple and make sacrifices in the outer court with the help of the temple priests. And so that leads us now to the conversation of the priesthood. Now in the kingdom, we return to a time in which only some people will be designated as priests. But there is a change in this case, because in the kingdom period, Levites will not be priests. Ezekiel says this in chapter 44, verse 10. But the Levites who went far from me when Israel was astray, who went astray from me after their idols, shall bear the punishment for their iniquity, and they shall not come near to me to serve as a priest to me, nor come near to any of my holy things, to the things that are most holy, but they will bear their shame in the abominations which they've committed. Yet I will appoint them to keep charge of the house, of all its service, and of all that shall be done in it. So God says that because of the historical unfaithfulness of the Levites to God, this is back in the time right before Ezekiel saw the temple destroyed, the nation had gone into deep idolatry, and the priesthood was actually facilitating that rather than standing against it. And God said because of that offense, when they get to the kingdom, they're going to have a more limited role than they used to enjoy. He says in verse 13 up there that they shall not come near him or his holy items, the holy things in the temple. Very different than, of course, what you see in the Mosaic Law. They're the only ones who can go near them in the Mosaic Law. Instead, he says that they are going to minister effectively as the keepers of the temple, the custodians of the temple, but not as priests. Instead, only one family within the line of Levites is going to have that privilege in the temple period. It's the family of Zadok. Ezekiel says, but the Levitical priests, the sons of Zadok, who kept charge of my sanctuary when the sons of Israel went astray from me, shall come near to me to minister to me, and they shall stand before me to offer me the fat and the blood, declares the Lord God. They shall enter my sanctuary. They shall come near to my table to minister to me and keep my charge. Isaiah told us that in addition to all of these Jews that we're talking about, the priests of Zadok and Levites and so on, he said that Gentiles will also be recruited as priests in the temple. So what we're learning is, in addition to the priests of Zadok, there will be some Gentiles from among the nations of the earth who are given the privilege to serve as priests as well. Perhaps some of us will be in that role. In the way that the priests operate, there is some other differences, we're told. They will not do some of the sacrificial work they used to do. In the law of Moses, it was the priests it was the worshipers who had to sacrifice the animal. The priests were there to officiate, and they took the sacrificial pieces up to the altar and did the rest of the work. But the actual killing of the animal had to be done by the worshiper. The dad who brought the lamb up had to slit the throat. Now, in the time of the kingdom, Ezekiel tells us that the priests will take on that duty. And it'll be the Levites, the ones who are unfaithful, who get that job. They have the dirty work of killing the animals and all of that, preparing the slaughter, and then the priests of Zadok take it the rest of the way through the process of worship. And by the way, I got a few pictures of that just for those who might be interested. If you notice, over here in the corners that are created by the intersection of the priest chambers and this mysterious building, there are these little barbecues, for lack of a better term. And if you zoom in on one of those corners, these are the places that Ezekiel tells us that the slaughter will take place, the animals will be killed, and there will be burning pits here for the animal sacrifices, since the altar is not big enough to handle the volume of people that will be coming in here. And they're not just here up by the corners of the temple, they're also positioned, if you can kind of see down here, by the entrance side of the building. There's more of these pits in the corners. So this will be the way people are called to sacrifice during the temple. Now, that raises the last question for the night. We have these burning pits for sacrifice. We have priests for sacrifice. Well, wait a minute. If Christ is our high priest, why was any of this even necessary? Why are there priests? Why is there sacrifice? Jesus was the once for all sacrifice, right? And over the centuries, theologians, when they get to the book of Ezekiel and the concept of a kingdom, a temple, they've been troubled at this prospect of a return of a sacrificial system. Because if you remember from the letter of Hebrews, we're told definitively in chapter 10 that by this we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But he, having offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time onward until his enemies be made a footstool for his feet. For by one offering he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. That's basic New Testament theology, that the substitutionary atonement of Jesus on the cross satisfied, appeased the wrath of God, and as such there is no sacrifice required evermore. And that's not just for one person or one period of history, it's for all time. And so it begs the question, why does God reinstitute a temple and a sacrificial system? And we'll finish now with how it changes the kingdom. When God dwelled in a building, people had to do their physical sacrifice there. The effect of that physical sacrifice was it cleansed their guilty conscience. They knew God approved of their heart of worship, and it restored them to others in that same group, in the body of Israel or in the body of Christ. It gave us opportunity to restore fellowship because of the cleared conscience and the sacrifice that came with it. And then we move to the church. Now the church doesn't have a building. Everybody is the building. So we make those sacrifices not through cutting up of animals, but by the crucifying of our own flesh. But it has the same effect. It cleanses our conscience when we do good works. It causes us to be reconciled with our brothers and sisters whom we may have hurt. It causes us to become more Christ-like in our sanctified walk. Those things are to the benefit of our relationships here on earth. And now in the kingdom, where does God dwell? If you know where he dwells, then you know what kind of sacrifices are required. Once again, God dwells in a building, not in human bodies. Israel is again the chief nation on the earth. Because Israel is again the chief nation on the earth, well then again, God goes back to dwelling with them because that's his promise. And he puts a building up, and he gets back in the building as we just saw. So we have God dwelling in Shekinah glory in the building, and we have a worshiper in the time of the temple. And the worshiper wants to be reconciled to God spiritually, and as always, it's done through faith in Jesus Christ. But now God also demands a physical sacrifice to reconcile this individual with others in their on earth, with other humanity. Now in the time of a physical temple, you're going to have a physical sacrifice before God in his presence. And in the time when there is no temple, like there is no temple now, that is no physical temple, it's done through the good works of the believer. That is, our body is the physical temple. But I hope that helps you understand that there is nothing undermining of your faith in the fact that a temple reemerges any more than there is that there was once a temple before. It simply reflects the reality that until all sin is done away with, there is both the need to be reconciled to God and to have a daily opportunity to be reconciled with one another. One final note, all of what I just described is for those who have sin. Those of us who live in the kingdom, who have no sin, do not participate in the sacrificial system because we have no need. Our sin has been removed from us, and so as a result, we are entirely the overseers of this stuff. We are not those who come to the temple and sacrifice. It'll be for the natural born of the day who have sin and are there either believer or unbeliever who have to come before the temple and do what God requires. Only the believers will be able to come in to that place where they can see inward and know that God is present.